DC here. Hi guys and gals. Well, I hope you're all well. You know, it's Friday, and Friday very often when I get the chance I try and do a little vlog. I wanted to do it over lunchtime today, but ended up being a little bit too tight with my time over lunch. And I found actually an interesting article to talk about. So here I am at home tonight. Once I got home, well, it's a TGIF moment. Not quite as soon as I got home. When I got home, Mrs. DC was, she's working again today, but it's the end of the month, so I just, paid the bills online. So now it's definitely a TGIF moment. Well, I was going to talk about an article that I found in the health section of the Atlantic magazine. And the article, so here it is. It was the most dangerous way to lose yourself. It was talking about identity fusion. And it looked really interesting in the beginning. And you'll see why I say it in the beginning, because I'll go on a few more about what it was in, and you'll see how I got into it, and then all of a sudden got turned off slightly. Now the article starts talking about John F. Kennedy when he was 17, and that he was part of a prank club, basically, and that he wanted to put manure in the gymnasium. Anyway, they got caught, and he would have, or actually he was expelled, but I suppose because he was a Kennedy, they came back. But anyway, the headmaster suggested that Kennedy see a gland specialist. By the way, this is 1935, to help him overcome his strange childlessness. It's kind of funny anyway. So anyway, the psychiatrist or what the psychologist was a man called Prescott Leckie. That's not so important actually, but the idea is that he was interrogating Kennedy's sense of self. I didn't actually make notes, but I did write down places where were kind of interesting. And the thing is he was saying that Kennedy had this self-view from his family, that he was the sloppy and inefficient one of the family. Kind of interesting, when you think of what John F. Kennedy became. And so that basically he felt that he had to confirm the image that was given of him and the family. Okay. So, it was like sometimes the psychologists were saying that sometimes when we've got this actual personal view of ourselves, that we kind of work at it to almost, we could say, bring it into fruition. And sometimes those worldviews or those self-views of ourselves are very damaging and very bad for our self-worth, but it's the way we feel we are, and we just kind of like make life happen so that it, self-prophecy, self-fulfilling prophecy. So within that, there was one thing that came up, is that it was a question of identity, and we could almost say group pressure. So when was it, that all of a sudden a person would kind of like fuse his own identity with that of a group with which he identified, be it truly or falsely? And so the idea of this psychologist and different psychology studies were that we would take on other identities of our own. Now, the whole thing that comes in that is because people are starting to think of, here you get it coming, radicalization, getting into a bad group, the influence, group influence. I think, we've heard of peer pressure before. So sometimes I wonder when I see these articles, it's like, are they rediscovering something that we all know about? Peer pressure. But peer pressure is something slightly different here. Peer pressure is you do something you don't really want to, and the self-identity is you kind of, they say, fuse. So you basically become something or someone else. So the basis was, in this, is that sometimes, now this is where you can almost see the peer pressure thing, sometimes we bond especially strongly with some of our associations, such as family, military groups, or religion. We can, we say we can't imagine existing without something, and so on and so on. You are part of the team, and you are you, and there's a problem between the self and the other. Okay, all good, and I'd say up to a point true. And of course they said, well, you could see this essentially when it came out with 9/11, with all the terrorist things, the willingness to die and to kill thousands in the process. And it is actually here not, as some person said, someone did something. No, it is really something, a fusion in a way, or a radicalization, an allegiance that basically takes over your own identity. Your identity is lost. I think we used to call that brainwashing. Anyway, so so that's a bit where it is. And let me see if I continue within that. So they were saying, is that when your identities are fused, you'll become, as to be expected, somebody else. Now, of course, I found this was, it was interesting. It was interesting until all of a sudden I realized that the person that was writing it finally took part of the article to, I would say, go after the conservatives, and particularly in the American political situation. Don't forget, this is American Magazine. To go against Trump, because of course the people that write here tend to be more to the left, definite left of center. So of course, there was the usual thing about people becoming, this and that way because they were like fusing and so on with the Trump mentality. Now, of course, what I found is that I can get what they're talking about. The problem is that you could say the same thing about probably 3/4 or 90% of the state of California, where the mentality of the left is the same. What it got me to thinking, though, and in the sense of maybe the American political situation, but actually political situations in many countries, the Americans will talk about the Electoral College, and they will scream, or they will say that somebody can win a popular vote but still lose an election. And it's the same in Canada and in Switzerland, for example, where you will have the popular vote, but then you have to have the vote of the states that come up to it. I mean, so it's kind of like the Swiss equivalent or what of the Electoral College in America. And why I bring that is that the people at the time when they wrote these constitutions and these rules, we could say, had something I think really good in mind, is that what I would call the lemming mentality. Now, it's not because, for example, let's take in the American case, that a state like California, which has an enormous population, but basically has almost a fused identity, they count for less people than, another part of America, which would have another way of seeing things. And that is the idea of the Electoral College, is that you don't, or as we have here in Switzerland with the cantons and so on, that you don't have a group that takes over the country just because they are more and they all think alike and so on. Now, I know there's a lot of discussion about that, but that was basically what was behind all these, is that I don't think they were thinking about fuse mentalities or that, but over proportionality of a thought process. And we all know it. I think if we live in a place where you're surrounded by people that are all thinking the same, after a while, it doesn't mean that you fall into line with them, but sometimes you could get kind of like so-called brainwashed. Now, I don't want to bring that into a completely political thing, because I found that the author here tried to do that at the end. Now, what I found, like I said, was interesting, and I'm coming up to 10 minutes, I'm going to have to stop this soon. What I found really interesting was the whole thing of the group mentality, where if it really gets to the core of your person, you really do eventually change your way of thinking, almost your core being. And then you have to go back, I guess, and we could say into rehab of some type. And I think that is what is done with some of the extreme cases where basically you have to re-educate, or the person has to relearn how to think, think by themselves. So, okay, what do you think about all this? It's a bunch of rubbish. Like I say, I liked the paper a lot until all of a sudden I found that there was a political thing that was actually pretty biased as well, sadly to say. Anyway, but it was an interesting paper, and it's an interesting concept about group pressure and so on. So I'm coming up to 11 minutes. I'll be DC signing off. I hope that you have a good weekend, and I'll be back most probably over the weekend. Take care, everybody. Bye.